to make meaningful measurements, you want to control ሁሉም ቀጠሉ የሚያዩን ላይቱን ኮንትሮል ማድረግ ትፈልጋለህ ሂዩሚዲቲውን ሞይስቸሩን ኮንትሮል ማድረግ CO2ን ኮንትሮል ቴምፕሬቸሩን all of those things መሳሪያው የሚሰራው ስለዚህ ያኛው የምታሳየው የነበረው እሱም ላይት ኮንትሮል አለው it just doesn't do fluorescence so there were several questions let me see if I can remember Yikber his question was if we you mentioned that if you don't want to use that fluorescence but he's saying well if we don't use the fluorometer how can we control the light and so I was explaining the other one is also a light source it also has the red blue ratio or
there's also the light source only option here in the chamber setup so I came to the chamber setup to show you how to tell it what aperture you have but you can also tell it that you're going to use light source only, and that means you can still use it as a light source, but none of the fluorescence parameters will appear. So yes, you could absolutely choose to use the fluorometer chamber and not do fluorescence.
Okay, so the other question was, Dagu had the question. One was about, how can we just get the main parameters out? And I explained there in that gas exchange group, he mentioned specifically net photosynthesis, stomatoconductance, intercellular CO2. I mentioned there and there, but all the others are important to make sure that those values make sense because they are calculated values. You should look at the others. And so that was one question he had. The other question was related to more practically when you make a measurement. He said when they were making a measurement in the morning, they were asking between themselves, like, should we do the young leaf, the old leaf, at the top of the tree, below the tree, what's their recommendation? And then when do we take these measurements at maturation stage, early stage, vegetation stage, that kind of stuff. So if you could expand on that.
That it is almost as if I had told you to ask this question because the next thing we're going to talk about in the class is the theory of taking survey measurements in terms of what we do. And you've already taken some, but we're going to talk about why some of the, I just gave you some environmental parameters yesterday. And I said, set these to this. And I didn't necessarily explain why, but that's the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to talk about how we think, how we choose environmental parameters for survey measurements, things to consider when we're thinking about choosing leaves for survey measurements. And then, so it's almost as if I had prompted you to ask this question because it goes into the next thing we're going to talk about perfectly. But before we transition to that, I want to make sure there are no questions about the hands-on measurements that you took. Any more questions about how you chose the measurement? We'll talk about the leaves and the environmental parameters, but did you have any questions about how you knew when to log or anything like that? I want to make sure that we cover that before we transition to talking about the theory of survey measurements. Were there any other questions about that?
እስራኤል አሁን ይሰማል?
ይሰማኛል። ያው ዲስኮኔክት አድርጎ ነበር።
መብራት ነው።
ኦኬ መብራት ነው የሚጠፋው።
መብራት ይጠፋል ጌታ። ስክሪን ሼር ላድርግህና አንድ ጥያቄ አለን።
እሺ
እኛ ስንለካ ጠዋት ይሄኛው ዲፎልቱን ነው የተጠቀምነው እና ለምሳሌ ካርቦን ዳይኦክሳይድ የሚታይ ከሆነ ከላይ 10 ነው የተጠቀምነው 100 ምናምን ይሄ በቃ አሲቲስ ነው የወሰድነው ነገር ግን ትናንትና እሱ ያሳየችው ስክሪን ላይ ይለይ ነበር የተወሰኑ እንትኖች ይለያሉና እነዚህ ዲፎልት ነው የምንወስደው ወይስ የምንሞላቸው ነገሮች አሉ የሚል ጥያቄ አለና እዚህ ጋር ብቻ አይደለም እዚህ ጋርም እነዚህ እንኳን ችግር የለባቸው እነዚህም ችግር የለባቸው እነዚህ ማች ኦፕሽን ላይ ግን የተወሰኑ ጥያቄዎች አሉና ምናልባት እሱን አንድ እንትን እንድታረገን ነው ብሪፍ እንድታረገን ፈልገን
እሺ ያ አይ ቲንክ እሺ ምንድነው ይሄ አየህ እንትን ነው ዋናው የኢምፖርታንት ቲንግ ነው ማቺንግ ብላ ስታወራት እዚህ ይላችኋል መጀመሪያ ቀን ምክንያቱም ምን ያህል ካርቦን ዳይኦክሳይድ ተወሰደ ምን ያህል ዋተር ተለቀቀ የሚለውን አሲሚሌሽን እና ትራንስፒሬሽንን የምንለካው ሁለት የተለያዩ ጋስ አናላይዘሮች በመጠቀም ነው አንደኛው ጋስ አናላይዘር ሬፈረንስ ሳይዱን ነው ቅጠል የሌለበት ሳይድ አለ እሱ ነው የሚለካው ሌላኛው ጋስ አናላይዘር ደግሞ ቅጠል ያለበትን ሳይድ ነው የሚለካው ስለዚህ ሁለት ጋስ አናላይዘሮች ነው ያሉት ስለዚህ ሁለቱን በየጊዜው አንድ እንዲሆኑ ወይም ተመሳሳይ ነገር እንዲያነቡ ካላረካቸው ቀስ በቀስ መለያየት ይጀምራሉ እና በሁለቱ ጋስ አናላይዘሮች መካከል ያለው ልዩነት ልክ እንደ photosynthesis መስሎ ካርበን እንደተወሰደ ወይም እንደተለቀቀ ካርቦን ዳይኦክሳይድ እንደተወሰደ ወይም እንደተለቀቀ ውሃ እንደተወሰደ እንደተለቀቀ ሊያስመስል ስለሚችል you have to match regularly አየሩ በሁለቱም ተመሳሳይ አየር በሁለቱም እንዲሄድ ያረክ basically ምንድነው you force them to read the same now the question here is when do you do that መቼ ነው ይሄንን ተመሳሳይ አየር ልከ ሪዲንጋቸው እንዲመሳሰል ፎርስ መታረገው በየስንት ጊዜው ነው እና አንደኛው ኦፕሽን እዚህ ጋር ያለችው never match መቼም ማታረግ ነው እሱ በጣም ትክክል ያልሆነ ነገር ነው unless የሆነ ስፔሻል ኬዝ ካልሆነ always match ደግሞ የሚለው ልክ አንድ ዳታ ከመውሰድ በፊት ይሄንን አየሩን አካሄዱን ይቀይረውና ወደ ቅጠሉ ወዳለበት ወደ ሬፈረንሱ የሚሄደውን ይቀይረውና ያ አንድ አየር ወደ ሁለቱም ጋር እንዲሄድ ያደርግና ፎርስ ያደርጋል እሱ አንድ ኦፕሽን ነው ሁሌ አንድ ያንዳንዱ ዴታ ፖይንት ከመወሰዷ በፊት ሁሌ ማች እንዲያደርግ ፎርስ ማድረግ ትችላለህ that's very ምንድነው አግሬሲቭ ነው ኮንሰርቫቲቭ ነው ሌላኛው ግን መቼ ነው ልዩነት ቢኖር ችግር ሊያመጣ የሚችለው ወይም ልዩነቱ ትልቅ ኢምፓክት ሊኖረው የሚችለው መቼ ነው ተብሎ ነው እና እነዚህ ጥሩ ግምቶች ናቸው መጀመሪያዎች ናቸው የመጀመሪያው ምንድነው በሁለቱ አናላይዘሮች መካከል ያለው ነው CO2R እና CO2 ሳምፕል ከ10 ppm of carbon dioxide በላይ ከሆነ maybe I'm sorry less than ከዛ ከሆነ let's match ነው ምን ማለት ነው በአንደኛው በኩል ቅጠሉ አለ በአንደኛው በኩል ቅጠል የሌለበት ቻምበር አለ ብለህ አስበው እና ቅጠሉ የሚወስደው CO2 ትንሽ ነው ስለዚህ ልዩነቱ በሁለቱ መካከል ከ10 በታች ነው ያ ማለት ምንድነው low assimilation rate ሊኖር ይችላል እዚህ low assimilation rate ያለው measurement ላይ ጋስ አናላይዘሮቹ ትንሽ የራሳቸው ልዩነት ካላቸው በዛ ሜዥር የምታረገው ነገር ላይ ያለው ኢምፓክት ትልቅ ነው ስለዚህ ያንን ትንሽ ሎው ሌቨል አሲሚሌሽን መለካት ላይ ያለው ኢምፓክት ትልቅ ስለሆነ 10 ታረጋዋለህ ሌላኛው ደግሞ የCO2R በየ100 ppm ከቀየረ ነው ሌላው ደግሞ በጊዜ ሂደት ማለት ነው 10 ደቂቃ ካለፈ ከላስት ታይም ማች ካረክ 10 ደቂቃ ካለፈ እንደገና ማች እንዲያረግ ታረጋዋለህ I think እነዚህ ጥሩ የመጀመሪያ ቦታዎች ናቸው በጊዜ ሂደት በጊዜ ሂደት መሳሪያውን ያወቀው ስትመጣ የምትመለካው አትክልት ወይም ቅጠል ያለውን ፐርፎርማንስ ያየኸው ስትመጣ እነዚህ ነገሮች መቀየር ይቻል ይሆናል ግን I think ለመጀመር እነዚህን መጠቀም ጥሩ ነው እስቲ እሷንም ልጠይቃት ከሌላ እንትኖች
ቅድም አሳይተናለችና አሁን ለምሳሌ 6 by 6 ነው እኛ ጋር አሁን ተያይዞ ያለው ነገር ግን ለግራስ ብላ ያሳየችውን ይሄ ሬክታንግሉ አይነቱ አለ መሳሪያው ነገር ግን ስንገጥመው ምናልባት ፈተን ነው ምናምን እያየሁት ነበርና ትንሽ ብሪፍ ቢደረግ እንትን ይመስለኛል ምክንያቱም ስንገጥመው ምናልባት በኋላ ላይ እንትን ይችላል
I don't know እሺ ጠይቃታለሁ I think maybe ጊዜ ካለን እኛም እናደርገው ይሆናል ግን I will ask yeah ሌላ ጥያቄ ነበር
የለኝም ጠርሻ
እሺ ለጊዜው እሺ so the question was about the when to match I tried to explain why and what these defaults are but his question was more should we always use these defaults or are there other reasons to change Elizabeth is smiling again so maybe that's what's going to go in the next lecture too but the other question the last question he had was about changing the chamber or changing the apertures like are we going to do that today or tomorrow or just to show how to do that yeah okay maybe we will do that tomorrow if we have time yeah
tomorrow we will discuss maintenance and calibration and part of maintenance and calibration is that you might need to change the chamber so we will make sure that we have a 3x3 chamber here so that we can show you how to change them it's very easy to change the chambers it is 4 screws in terms of changing the apertures, that's also very easy. And it's something that I can probably show once I have the fluorometer taken off the instrument. It'll be easier for you to see it because I know I was trying to show it on the iPad, but with the second camera we have, but it's very small. It's hard to see unless it's right next to the camera. So we can talk about that tomorrow when we talk about maintenance and calibration. I'm making a note to myself. In terms of the match defaults and whether there's any reason to change them. In terms of reference change for CO2, 100 ppm is a good default. If the delta, the difference between CO2R and CO2S is less than 10 ppm, that's a good default as well. The 10-minute time might be a little bit conservative. Most of the time people match every 20 to 30 minutes. So that might be a little bit conservative, but in most cases, it's better to start with conservative options and then change them to be a little bit more relaxed. So think of it when we were all growing up, our parents or those who took care of us gave us rules. And the rules were very firm about you will do this and this and this. But as you got older and you learned more, you learned that sometimes the rules were not as firm. You know, that there were exceptions, that sometimes there were things, but we started out with a small set of rules that are very firm. And we say, okay, as we learn more, we can, the rules can become more loose. The rules can become more flexible. So it's okay to start with a very conservative match time and say, I match every 10 minutes. And then if you realize when you look at your data after you've seen it for a little while that there's really not much change and you didn't need to match every 10 minutes, then you could say, okay, I'm going to match every 20 to 30 minutes. So most of the defaults in this software start very conservative so that you will probably be fine. You might do things a little bit more often than you need to, but that's better than doing them less often than you need to, especially as you're just starting out. So I would leave the delta CO2 the same. I would leave the reference change in CO2 the same. The one that I might change as I got to know my plant a little bit better is changing that time elapsed from 10 minutes to 20 or 30. You don't want to go longer than 30 minutes, just because in 30 minutes you may